Hey guys, I'm here today to do a review and discussion video about a book that I read a few weeks ago and thought was absolutely phenomenal and such an amazing book, and I'd really like to recommend it to lots and lots of people. So the book is After the Eclipse, and this is a memoir by Sarah Perry. Now this isn't the Sarah Perry a lot of us know from the Essex Serpent. This Sarah Perry is from the US and she is a college lecturer and she teaches creative non-fiction, I believe. And this is a memoir about her mother. This is beautifully written. When I read the first 2 pages, I instantly felt so pulled into her life and just loved her writing style. You know, when you start reading something, you just know that someone is so adept at describing a moment, and they can describe the physicality of that moment as well as, without really having to say, describe the emotions of that moment. And you, without knowing their past, you already feel nostalgia attached, even though you obviously don't experience the nostalgia they do. You still feel it, it's still really present in their writing, and I felt that within 2 pages, and so I was, you know, already committed to loving this book. And it's an odd book to say that I love, because this book, as I said, is focused on Sarah's mother, Crystal, and Crystal was actually sexually assaulted and then murdered when Sarah was herself very young. And Sarah was in the house when this happened and woke up in the middle of the night to hear it happening, and then she saw her mother's body after the event, and she was the person who ran to get help, to get the emergency services, and her mother didn't survive. And this book could be something that we're used to seeing. It could be a true crime book that looks at who this person was who did this, and really delves into the fact that this crime went unsolved for many years until somebody was eventually found guilty and convicted. But for many years this crime went unsolved. And so this could be one of those true crime books. You know, true crime is a massive thing right now. I think Making a Murderer really sort of brought it into the forefront of the public eye, and there's loads of documentaries, loads of books, and people seem to be really honing in on it at the moment. I think it's always been something that's popular, but at the moment it seems to be really at the forefront. And this could be that, but it really isn't. In fact, this makes all those programmes and books look quite cheap and seedy, and actually really made me consider what sort of person I was, that I wanted to consume media like that. And I say that because what this book does is it starts off with a before and after section, and the after section is from the moment of the crime taking place onwards. So we follow what happens to Sarah from the moment that her mother is attacked and passes away forward, and then in between those after chapters there's before chapters, and those before chapters go all the way back to the point of her mother Crystal's birth up until the point of her death. And the first half of the book is like that until you catch up with the before, and the whole book becomes the after, and that's really when they're starting to find somebody to convict, and the book focuses a bit more on that. So there's so many things I want to say about this, and I don't really know what order to say them in. The first thing I want to comment on is that this is just a beautiful exploration of a woman and a relationship. Crystal is perfectly captured in these pages, and it feels odd to say that stripping away what happened to her, she'd be a fascinating person to read about, but yet I feel like she would. The love that Sarah has for her mother and the understanding she has, and I think it really changes the relationship, that Sarah only ever knew her mother when she herself was a child, and so she's now, as an adult who actually has survived to be older than her mother ever was, can look back on the strength of her mother as a single parent who worked a really hard job, really long hours for not much pay, and managed to raise her daughter alone. And this woman who's desperate to find love and sort of met these different men who, you know, were never really going to be the answer to that, but after this awful childhood she had, really was so optimistic to still believe that there was love and happiness in relationships out there. She's a wonderful person to read about, and it's a beautiful relationship to read about between the two of them, and it's so confrontingly honest. So there's a section I want to read out here because I think it really perfectly shows how completely laid bare this memoir is. I think it must have been an incredibly difficult memoir to write, and I think there must come a point in a lot of memoirs where somebody thinks, I'm going to keep that back for me. Like, not only do I not want that out there in the world for others to know about me, but I can't even admit it to myself, like, let alone, like, I couldn't even write it in my own diary, do you know what I mean? Let alone accept it about myself, write it and put it out there in print. And this book is astounding, and that Sarah Perry does that. So I'm just going to read you an excerpt to give you an example of that. If I felt responsible for her loneliness, if I could barely leave her for a night, and if even her adult friends thought I had a duty to take care of her, what would my love feel like for her today? I am overwhelmed thinking about the hot, dense feeling of that bond, its intense gravitational force. How would I have ever moved away from her? I imagine daily phone calls, worries about her health, about her boyfriend or husband. Is she eating enough? Is that fatigue or sadness in her voice? I imagine my own friends and partners finding it all a bit too intense. I think about the burden of this love, and I'm grateful for a moment for my freedom, and then guilt flashes in my chest like heat lightning, followed by a rumbling quake of sadness. So, as I said, it's just beautifully written, and so gut-wrenching in its honesty. So the point that Sarah Perry's trying to make, and what I really took from this memoir, is that when somebody is killed in the way that Crystal was killed, in the media they become that crime, they become the body, and we don't really talk about who they were much anymore, and if we do, it's this sort of cardboard cutout, this really easy to digest line that the media feeds us. And actually all these books that are out now and all these programs, documentaries and news articles deal with the crime scene, with the blood splatter analysis, with the various suspects and how law enforcement failed and all these things. And I'm not saying those things aren't important, but what I am saying is, and what Sarah Perry is saying, is that there's a person behind all that. There's someone who wasn't just a victim. They weren't a victim for their whole lives. They were a victim in that final moment, but they lived a whole life before that, and they would have led a whole life after that. And they're vital. They're so important. And really, you know, whilst it's important to talk about justice and the value of the criminal justice system, and if people are wrongfully convicted, it's equally important to talk about the people behind these crimes. And actually, this book just does that, you know, astonishingly well. And also what I felt towards the end when, you know, she's getting to the point where there may be a conviction, the book doesn't then become this true crime book, because I started to think, you know, I don't think this book is suddenly going to become this big analysis, and it really doesn't. You know, the person who did it doesn't take over the story, because it's not his story, it's Crystal's life, and it's Crystal who matters, and this person who did this awful thing shouldn't be the one we, you know, we do need to spend time looking at what makes people commit crimes, certainly, and that's an important thing to do, but we shouldn't let that overshadow the people who have suffered because of it. And there's a moment in this book, and there's so many moments, but there's a moment, another moment I want to read out to you, which I think really made me think so much more about the way I perceive true crime and justice and all these things in the media. So this bit is a moment when Sarah Perry's at the gym, and there's lots of widescreen TVs showing a true crime programme which has crime scene footage of a woman's dead body, and there's lots of other women on the treadmills around her running and just, you know, acting like that's a perfectly normal thing to just be presented at when you're on the treadmill at the gym. But maybe some of them did feel the same choking anger. I looked to the left, to the right, taking in girls with long strides, bouncing ponytails, and other women marching along, faces tense with what looked like desire. 20% of American women are victims of rape. In Bridgeton, that would make about 500 women, twice the high school's population of girls. I was then living in a town 4 times the size of Bridgeton, and so I wondered which of the women around me might also be struggling to breathe, keeping their faces neutral and stoic. But we were an invisible club, estranged by the need to cope, to pretend all day, every day, that everything was fine. To imagine that society and law enforcement and the courts would behave exactly the same way if something so terrible happened to 1 in 5 men. that conviction rates would be the same, that the world would find those crimes just as entertaining as it found these, that we weren't being further subjugated by having to be still and take it, pretend outward calm and enjoy the show. And it just made me think of the amount of people in like my daily life who I come into contact with who are like silently suffering when we portray true crime or fictionalised crime in the media, and there's a massive fascination in these things with the sexual assault and murder of women. And part of that is because that is so prevalent in crime. You know, 1 in 5 American women are sexually assaulted. 38% of women worldwide are killed by their intimate partners. You know, all these statistics, in a way it makes sense that so much of what we see in true crime or in these police procedurals, these TV dramas, is usually about, you know, the episode starts with a dead woman's body. But at the same time, by showing us these things, even in fiction, it normalises it, and it becomes so that we're so used to seeing these things, we no longer question them, and we no longer question the motivation we have behind consuming true crime. Because what this really made me think is that there was 2 episodes on various US TV channels made about Crystal Perry and her murder, and Sarah Perry said she doesn't support either of them. One of them she agreed to talk to the producers, and then once it aired she was appalled at the way it had been constructed, and said that she felt that her mother had been completely lost and it got really obsessed with the crime scene and blood splatter and all those things, and, you know, really lost who her mother was. And I thought that's how the majority of these programmes are shown. So, you know, the first series of Making a Murderer, I thought it was a phenomenal documentary, and I think it was important in that, whilst I do feel like Teresa Halbach was lost in that series, who she wasn't what was at the forefront. The series was tackling the fact that these people have, from the perspective of that television programme, had been wrongfully convicted. So we were looking at a different type of victim to the victim of the actual crime. We were looking at these secondary victims, these people who'd been wrongfully accused. But there's other programmes and books that focus on, you know, a crime and trying to find out who the killer is. And they're not looking at people who are wrongfully convicted. It's not an assessment of the justice system. It's this thrill, it's this page turner, it's who did it. And we're losing in all that these are people that this happened to, and they have a story, and their families live and are out there. And imagine if something like this happened to someone you loved and who meant so much to you, and they just became this victim, this body, in a half-an-hour TV expose, or were written about in passing in a book like I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which I bought and now don't feel like I really want to read, because I feel like it's not about the people, it's about true crime and this obsession with true crime and finding the killer, and the killer becomes the story, not the people who it happened to. So yeah, I think this is a phenomenal book. It's a beautiful memoir, it's exquisitely written, but also as well as being just a beautiful look into their relationship and who Crystal Perry was as a person, it's also so thought-provoking, a really interesting look at the way children are dealt with in the criminal justice system, how it really affected the rest of her life, and how she now moves for a world that views this as so commonplace it can be shown on a widescreen TV in a gym, you know? So yeah, I thought this was astounding, and since then I have read The Mother of All Questions, Further Feminisms by Rebecca Solnit, and also The Reckonings by Lacey M. Johnson. I'm halfway through this, and I think they're really good books to read around the same time as After the Eclipse, because they explore, not as intimately, but they explore lots of those topics of discussion that Sarah Perry sort of got me thinking about. And there's an excerpt I want to read from this as well, which I think really struck a chord with me after reading After the Eclipse. Both autopsy and atrocity require a witness, someone who survives, who sees for herself with her own eyes. But the violence changes the person who looks. And then she goes on to describe the fact that there was a film out in the 90s called Traces of Death, and it was rumoured to show real footage of people who were killed through execution or committed suicide, and lots of people were saying, oh my god, you know, have you found the footage, have you seen it? And I remember years ago, you know, young men who I worked with watching execution footage on these, you know, dark websites online and all these things, and thinking it's so bizarre that you'd actively seek out watching something like this for like this thrill, like fictionalized versions of this in movies, which are already horrific enough, aren't enough. And that surely at some bizarre point we've got to in society where people want to see these horrific things, and by seeing these horrific things you normalise it. As she says, like she goes on to say that she saw some photographs of an atomic bomb scene and these bodies, and the more you look at these photographs, the less they become people. They eventually become bodies, and then the more you look, they just become limbs or arms or legs, until eventually you just look at it as this big, you know, area of rubble, and you don't really notice these people anymore because it becomes normalised, and we see so much in the media now that all these things become normalised. So I hope that made sense somewhat. As I said, I'm still really thinking a lot about the topics in After the Eclipse, and yeah, like they're all going off in various places, and I'm reading more things about it and will continue to read more things about it, but I'd really like to know your thoughts down below, and particularly about the way you feel true crime is presented and our motivations for reading or watching programmes about true crime. One I watched that I think is really good and handles everything really well is the documentary about the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, because it's I think it's an 8-part series, and it really is a deep dive into everything related to that and to their murders. It really looks into the portrayal of African Americans in the media at the time. It looks into the route that OJ's lawyers went. It looks into the way we viewed sportsmen in the US at the time. It looks into domestic violence, and it doesn't lose anyone within that series. I felt that it was detailed and informative enough by being this, you know, 8-part series, that it could articulate it well. And I think that is what I want from true crime, because I want, you know, when I watch these programs or read these things, I want to do it so that I, you know, I'm forced to think about the reason these crimes happen, the reason we live in a society where they're normalised, and the reason our society allows these sort of crimes, the rape and murder of women, to be so prevalent. And so when true crime actually analyses those topics, then I'm interested. But when a true crime series or book or whatever just wants to have a cheap thrill and talk about this is what the crime scene looked like, these are the suspects, then I don't really understand what our motivations are for being interested in that. And so yeah, I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts, and I highly recommend this book. It's absolutely beautiful. Like I said, I think I've said it all, but I really think it's such a wonderful book to read. It is difficult. There are descriptive passages about the murder of Crystal Perry. They're not easy to read, but in its completeness, it's more a book about the love of a mother and what a wonderful person Crystal was and could have continued to be, and how the loss of her has affected Sarah for, you know, for the rest of her life. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this. Let me know down below if you've read it. I'd really like to know your thoughts. and feel free to recommend me any other memoirs that you think deal with topics like this in the right way, because I thought this was phenomenal. So yeah, that's going to be a nightmare of a video to edit because I'm sure I've gone off on loads of tangents, but thanks for your patience and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!